Miss Marple and the Murder of Inspector Harrington. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, and it's such a pleasure to have you with us again. Our community stretches across so many places, and I'm always curious. Where are you listening from, and what's the weather like this evening? Share a little note below, and don't forget to subscribe for our daily stories. Now let's dive into the mystery. Chapter 1. Harrington at the Blue Boar. The early September afternoon lay soft and golden over St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, seated in her accustomed chair by the window of her cottage, watched the high street with the gentle attention that had served her so well over the years. Nothing of consequence had occurred that day, unless one counted Mrs. Clement's new hat, which was a quite extraordinary shade of puce, and demonstrated, Miss Marple thought charitably, that even the vicar's wife was not immune to the occasional lapse in judgment. At 4, a dark saloon motor car drew up outside the Blue Boar, and a tall man in a mackintosh emerged carrying a small overnight case. Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking. She did not recognize him, which was in itself noteworthy in a village where every face was catalogued in her comprehensive mental directory. The gentleman had the unmistakable bearing of a policeman. Not the local sort, she decided, but someone from the county offices, perhaps higher. He moved with the confident economy of a man accustomed to authority. Yet there was a weariness about his shoulders that suggested he had been traveling for some hours. Miss Marple returned to her knitting with renewed interest. A visiting inspector meant business of some kind, and business in St. Mary Mead had a way of becoming interesting. By 6 the intelligence network of the village, which operated with remarkable efficiency through the persons of Miss Hartnell, the fishmonger's wife, and the girl at the post office, had confirmed that the gentleman was indeed County Inspector Harrington, come down from Much Benham to confer with Inspector Slack on what was delicately termed a matter of ongoing investigation. When Miss Marple arrived at the Blue Boar for her customary Wednesday evening glass of sherry, taken in the company of her dear friend Dolly Bantry, the tap room was more animated than usual. The presence of a strange inspector had stirred the conversational pot considerably. Florence Pike, the landlady, moved between tables with her characteristic briskness, a woman of perhaps 50 with iron-gray hair pulled back severely, and a figure that suggested both strength and discipline. She carried a heavy tray with practiced ease, pouring tea and beer with hands that never trembled. Miss Marple noticed, as she always noticed such things, that Mrs. Pike poured with her left hand, shifting the pot or pitcher with a deft twist that spoke of long habit. At the corner table sat Edmund Vale, the contractor, whose name had been mentioned in connection with the proposed renovation of the parish hall. He was a smooth man, Miss Marple thought, in the way that pebbles in a stream become smooth by having all their rough edges worn away through constant movement. His suit was well cut, his manner affable, and his eyes were everywhere. Beside him perched Miss Rose Latimer, his typist, a thin woman with sharp features and a way of watching everything while appearing to watch nothing. Miss Marple recognized the type. Her own parlor-maid, Lucy, had possessed just such powers of observation, combined with an unfortunate tendency to draw the most dire conclusions from perfectly innocent circumstances. Near the fireplace, though no fire was lit on such a mild evening, Ted Jessup sat with his wife, Connie. Ted was the village's plumber and gas-fitter, a stocky man with capable hands, permanently stained with the marks of his trade. Connie was a softer presence, helping in the Blue Boar's kitchen when Florence needed an extra pair of hands. Inspector Slack arrived at 7, his face wearing its habitual expression of irritated competence. He nodded curtly to the room in general and moved to the private parlor, where Miss Marple understood he was to meet with his colleague. Lady Bantry arrived in a flurry of parcels and apologies. Dolly Bantry had been Miss Marple's friend since girlhood, and the years had treated them with the same gentle hand, leaving them comfortable in each other's company. and reliably interested in the small dramas of village life. They took their seats near the window, and Florence brought them sherry without being asked. Another, left-handed pour that Miss Marple filed away in the capacious storage of her mind. Inspector Harrington emerged from the parlor at 20 minutes past 7, and Miss Marple observed him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 55, with graying hair and a face that had seen much and judged little. There was something inherently decent about him, she thought. Not brilliant, perhaps, but thorough and fair, the sort of policeman who would follow every thread until it led somewhere, or proved conclusively to lead nowhere at all. He took his supper in the tap room, cold chicken and bread with a pint of ale, eating steadily and listening to the conversation around him with the professional attention of a man who knew that truth often emerged from casual talk. Edmund Vale held forth on the difficulties of modern building work, the cost of materials, the unreliability of subcontractors. Ted Jessup contributed observations about the plumbing in the new council houses. It was all very ordinary, and Miss Marple suspected that Inspector Harrington was learning a great deal. At 10 minutes to 8, Harrington pushed back his plate and addressed Florence Pike, his voice carried clearly in the sudden lull of conversation. "I should like a hot bath, Mrs. Pike, if it is not too much trouble. A scalding one if your geyser will oblige. I have had a long day, and I find that a proper bath works wonders for both body and spirit." Florence assured him that the bathroom was ready and the geyser in excellent order. Ted Jessup added with the pride of the craftsman that he serviced it himself, and it had never given a moment's trouble since installation 3 years prior. Inspector Harrington collected his case and a small packet from his coat pocket. Epsom salts. Miss Marple recognized them. Her own father had sworn by them after a day's walking. The inspector paused at the foot of the stairs. "Inspector Slack, if you would be so kind as to call for me at 8:15, we might review those files before the evening grows too late." Slack agreed with a grunt, and Harrington climbed the stairs with the deliberate step of a tired man, anticipating relief. The tap room settled back into its evening rhythm. Edmund Vale returned to his discourse on parish hall specifications. Dr. Haydock arrived and was drawn immediately into a discussion of the Harvest Fete Committee's latest machinations. Miss Marple and Lady Bantry discussed the autumn bulb border for the church gardens. It was 20 past 8 when the thud came from overhead, heavy and final, like a sack of flour dropped on a wooden floor. The tap room fell silent. Florence Pike's head jerked up, and her left hand, holding the teapot, froze in mid-pour. Inspector Slack was on his feet immediately, taking the stairs 2 at a time. Florence set down the pot with excessive care and followed, her face suddenly old. The rest of the company looked at each other with the uncertain expressions of people who have heard something that might be nothing or might be everything. Miss Marple's needles had stopped moving entirely. She sat very still, her blue eyes fixed on the ceiling, and in that moment, she wore the expression that Lady Bantry had learned to recognize over 50 years of friendship. It was the look of a hunter who has just heard the snap of a twig in the forest. Chapter 2. A bath, a chain, a fall. The silence that followed Inspector Slack's departure up the stairs stretched thin and taut, like a wire pulled to breaking point. In the tap room, no one moved. Even Edmund Vale, who generally filled any pause with the sound of his own voice, sat mute, his smooth features arrested in an expression of polite concern. From above came the sound of knocking. Then Slack's voice, loud and official. "Inspector Harrington! Sir, are you quite well?" No answer came. More knocking, more insistent now, and Florence Pike's lighter tread reached the landing. Her voice carried down the stairwell higher than usual. "The door's chained from inside, Mr. Slack. He must have put it on when he went in." There was a brief conference, voices too low to distinguish words. Then Slack barked command. "Fetch a screwdriver, Mrs. Pike. A flat one and sharp about it." Ted Jessup rose from his seat. I have tools in my bag in the yard. Shall I fetch them? Slack's affirmative came quickly, and Ted moved with surprising speed for a man of his build. He returned within a minute carrying a worn leather satchel and took the stairs with the heavy tread of the working man. Lady Bantry leaned close to Miss Marple. Do you suppose he's taken ill, Jane? Poor man to come all this way and then collapse in a strange bathroom? Miss Marple said nothing, but her fingers had resumed their knitting with mechanical precision, the needles moving in time with some internal calculation. Dr. Haydock had already started up the stairs, his medical bag in hand. The rest of the company sat frozen, that particularly English paralysis that comes from not knowing whether intervention would be helpful or merely intrusive. The sound of metal against metal came from above. Then a scraping, and finally the distinct click of a chain sliding free. A moment later, Slack's voice, grim and final. Hey, up here now. The doctor disappeared into the bathroom, and the door closed behind him with a soft thud that seemed to Miss Marple's ears remarkably like the sound that had summoned them all to attention 5 minutes earlier. The wait was interminable. Edmund Vale rose and poured himself a whiskey without asking permission. Rose Latimer sat with her hands folded in her lap, her sharp eyes fixed on the ceiling. Connie Jessup twisted her apron between her fingers. When Dr. Haydock finally descended, his face was set in the professional mask that medical men adopt when delivering bad news. He's dead, he said without preamble. Inspector Harrington is dead. The taproom erupted in exclamations, questions tumbling over one another. Haydock raised a hand for silence. Carbon monoxide poisoning, I should say, though I will naturally conduct a proper examination. The room was full of it. The geyser was still burning, but barely, a yellow flame rather than blue. The poor fellow never had a chance once the gas began to build. But the door was chained, Florence said, her voice oddly flat. From inside. I saw it myself when we forced it. Haydock nodded. Indeed, and the window latched as well. He must have felt faint, perhaps tried to reach the door, but the monoxide works quickly in a confined space. He collapsed on the rug beside the bath. The water was still running, 2/3 full. How dreadful! Lady Bantry breathed. How perfectly dreadful! Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm. And the geyser, Doctor. You said it was burning with a yellow flame? Haydock turned to her, a flicker of respect crossing his tired features. Precisely, Miss Marple, which suggests insufficient ventilation or perhaps a blocked flue. The flame should burn blue when the apparatus is functioning correctly. Yellow indicates incomplete combustion, which produces carbon monoxide rather than carbon dioxide. Ted Jessup had returned to the tap room, his face pale beneath its weathered tan. That geyser was perfect this morning. Perfect! I checked it myself not 3 weeks ago. The flue was clear, the jet clean, everything as it should be. These things happen, Haydock said not unkindly. A bird's nest, perhaps, or a fall of soot. We will know more when we examine the apparatus properly. Inspector Slack descended with Florence trailing behind him. His expression was thunderous, the look of a man who has had his evening's work transformed from routine conference to unexpected catastrophe. The room will need to be left as it is until the proper authorities can be notified, he announced. Mrs. Pike, I must ask you to lock the door and give me the key. Dr. Haydock, you will need to make your report official. I shall telephone Much Benham immediately. He departed toward the small office where the telephone resided, and the taproom slowly released its collective breath. Miss Marple rose from her chair with the deliberate movements of age. If I might, Doctor, I should like to see the room. Not to disturb anything naturally, but I find that one's impressions are so much clearer when taken fresh. Haydock frowned. I'm not certain that would be appropriate, Miss Marple, Lady Bantry bristled. Jane has assisted the police on more than one occasion, Doctor, as you know perfectly well. I'm sure Inspector Slack would not object. As if summoned by his name, Slack returned from making his telephone call. His expression suggested that the conversation had not been pleasant. "The chief constable will be here within the hour," he said grimly, "and he will want answers that I do not yet have. Miss Marple, if you have any observations to offer, I will not refuse them, though I will ask you to touch nothing." They climbed the stairs in procession. Slack, Haydock, Miss Marple, and Lady Bantry, who refused to be left behind. Florence Pike unlocked the bathroom door with a key that trembled slightly in her left hand. The room was small, made smaller by the 4 people crowding the doorway. The geyser hung on the wall above the bath, a squat metal cylinder with copper pipes running to and from it. A tiny flame still flickered behind the viewing glass, pale yellow and sickly. Inspector Harrington lay on his back on the bath mat, his face peaceful, almost relaxed. His jacket had been removed and hung on the door hook. The packet of Epsom salts sat unopened on the shelf beside the sink. The window was indeed latched, a small sash that would barely admit a cat. The chain on the door hung limp now, the screwdriver marks fresh on the doorframe where Ted had forced it. Miss Marple's gaze traveled methodically around the room. She noted the level of water in the bath, the position of the towels, the bar of soap still in its dish. Her eyes paused at the geyser, moved to the ceiling where the flu register sat, then tracked down the wall. She took a step closer, her head tilted like a bird examining a particularly interesting insect. The flu register was blackened with soot, which was to be expected. But just below it, on the shelf that jutted from the wall, something caught her attention, a mark dark and wet, looking like a tear of black wax running down pale wood. "Doctor," she said softly, "would you say that mark was present before this evening?" Haydock moved beside her, peering at the streak. "It is difficult to say. Soot and moisture, I should think. The steam from the bath perhaps causing condensation." Miss Marple said nothing, but she drew her handkerchief from her sleeve and, very gently, using only the corner of the fabric, touched the mark. When she withdrew the cloth, it bore a smear of black that had the texture not of dry soot, but of something damp and almost pastel-like. She folded the handkerchief carefully and returned it to her sleeve. Her attention shifted to the window. The latch was a simple catch, the kind that hooked over a small metal loop. As she examined it, her sharp eyes detected something caught beneath the mechanism, a tiny fragment of something pale and fibrous. With great delicacy, she produced a hairpin from her carefully arranged white hair and teased the fragment free. It came away in a small curl, no larger than a rose petal, and proved to be a scrap of what looked like paper pulp, dried paste clinging to its edge. Lady Bantry watched her friend with the fascination of long familiarity. "Jane," she murmured, "what have you found?" Miss Marple straightened, replacing the hairpin in her coiffure. "Possibly nothing, Dolly dear. Possibly nothing at all. But I should very much like to see the kitchen, if Mrs. Pike would permit it." Florence, who had remained in the corridor, her face carefully blank, gave a small nod. "Of course, Miss Marple, though I cannot think what interest my kitchen could have in this sad business." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Humor an old woman, my dear. I find that kitchens so often tell us the most interesting stories about a household." Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices a soot tear. The descent to the kitchen was accomplished in silence, save for the creaking of the old stairs beneath their feet. Florence Pike led the way with the rigid posture of a woman steeling herself against judgment, though whether the judgment was her own or others remained unclear. The Blue Boar's kitchen was everything a kitchen should be, spacious, well-ordered, and bearing that particular smell of bread, herbs, and good cooking that speaks of competent housekeeping. A large range dominated one wall, its black iron surface gleaming with recent polishing. Copper pans hung in graduated sizes above the worktop, and a row of white pudding basins sat on the dresser like attentive soldiers. Miss Marple moved slowly through the space, her eyes taking in details with the systematic attention of a woman who has run her own household for more than half a century. She paused at the range, noting the ash pan beneath, the flue that rose up through the ceiling toward the floors above. "This flue," she said, addressing Ted Jessup, who had followed them down. "It serves only the kitchen range, does it not?" Ted nodded, grateful to be on familiar professional ground. "That's right, Miss Marple. The bathroom geyser has its own flue, separate-like, running up the outside wall. Installed it myself, as I mentioned. Each heating apparatus wants its own draft, see, or you get trouble and both flues draw well. Never had a complaint." Ted's voice carried the defensive note of the craftsman whose work has been called into question. "The geyser flue is checked regular. I see to it myself." Miss Marple made a small sound that might have been agreement. She moved to the range and peered at the hearthstone beneath it. Lady Bantry, hovering at her elbow, could see nothing of interest, only the usual accumulation of ash and the faint marks where the cleaning had not quite reached into the corners. But Miss Marple bent lower, her knees protesting the indignity, and with the same hairpin she had employed upstairs, she lifted something from the stone. It was barely visible, a pinhead of charred paper caught in a dampness of ash, as though something had dropped into the range, smoldered briefly, then expired. She rose with difficulty, and Lady Bantry offered her arm. "Do you see this, Dolly?" Miss Marple said quietly, displaying the hairpin with its tiny burden. Paper burned, but not entirely consumed. One might almost say it had been wet when it fell into the fire. Lady Bantry peered at it doubtfully. "I confess I cannot see what significance a scrap of paper might have, Jane. Papers fall into fires constantly. Cook is always complaining about the newspapers coming to bits." "Quite so," Miss Marple agreed. "But the question becomes, does paper usually fall into a fire that is not lit?" Florence Pike, who had been standing with her arms crossed, spoke sharply. "I had no fire this evening, too warm for it, and I was only plating cold pies for tomorrow's luncheon." "Indeed," Miss Marple said. "How very interesting." She moved to the scullery, a smaller room that opened off the kitchen proper. Here the air was cooler, and through the window one could see the yard where the dustbin stood, and the ice safe was built into the thick wall. A stone sink occupied one corner, and beside it sat a scrubbed table bearing the various implements of kitchen work. Upon this table, somewhat apart from the knives and wooden spoons, sat a pudding basin with a film of grayish pulp clinging to its rim. Miss Marple touched the rim with one careful finger, then brought it to her nose. The others watched this performance with varying degrees of bewilderment. "Mrs. Pike," Miss Marple said, "what was this basin used for this evening?" Connie Jessup answered before Florence could speak. "I was soaking labels off jars, Miss Marple. Mrs. Pike wants all the preserved jars cleaned proper before we start the autumn bottling." "Labels," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "And you soak them with water?" "Water and a bit of soda," Connie confirmed. "Makes the gums soft-like." Miss Marple brought her finger to her nose again, the gesture that in anyone else would have seemed indelicate. "But there is no scent of soda," she observed, "and the texture is not quite gum, is it? More like flour paste, I should say. The sort one might use for papering or for children's scrapbooks." Florence's expression flickered, a momentary tightening around the eyes. "I am sure I could not say what Connie used, Miss Marple. I leave such tasks to her judgment." But Connie was frowning now, genuine confusion on her round face. "I am certain I used soda from the box on the shelf, though. Now you mention it, the water did seem a bit thick-like. But I thought perhaps the jars had been sticky from the jam." Miss Marple moved to the kindling basket beside the range. Among the sticks and screwed paper lay a folded newspaper, an evening echo from 2 days prior. She lifted it with both hands and held it to the light. The paper was damp, its edges twisted and marked as though it had been rolled into a cone shape and then unrolled and folded flat again. "Does anyone recall rolling this newspaper?" she asked. The answers were uniformly negative. Florence compressed her lips. "Newspapers get used for all manner of things in a kitchen, Miss Marple. Kindling, wrapping, cleaning windows. I could not possibly account for every sheet." "No," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Of course not." She turned to the rubbish pail that stood near the scullery door. With the handle of a wooden spoon, she delicately lifted aside a potato peeling, some tea leaves, and there, a curled strip of newspaper perhaps 6 inches long. One side was plain newsprint. The other bore a coating of paste, flour and water by the look of it, not yet entirely dry. Dr. Haydock, who had maintained a skeptical silence, spoke at last. "Miss Marple, I begin to wonder if you suspect that Inspector Harrington's death was not in fact an accident." Miss Marple returned the strip to the pail and straightened. "I suspect nothing, Doctor. I merely observe. And what I observe is that a flue register shelf upstairs bears a wet mark of soot that should not be wet. But here in the kitchen, we find evidence of flour paste and rolled newspaper, and that the timeline of events this evening was remarkably convenient." "Convenient?" Slack echoed sharply. "How so?" Miss Marple touched the flue chain that hung beside the range, the chain that opened and closed the register in the flue above. When she withdrew her hand, her glove bore a faint mark. "See here, Inspector. The chain is quite clean where my hand touched it. But above, where the grime of months should sit undisturbed, there is also a clean patch. This register has been moved today, and recently." Ted Jessup stepped forward, his professional pride now thoroughly aroused. "If you are suggesting, Miss Marple, that someone tampered with the flue—" "I suggest nothing," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "But I do wonder about several things. I wonder why a geyser flue that draws well and is properly maintained should suddenly develop a blockage sufficient to cause death by carbon monoxide. I wonder why that blockage should clear itself so completely that no trace remains visible. I wonder about wet soot and flour paste and newspapers rolled into cones." "A cone," Lady Bantry said suddenly. "Jane, you said something about a cone upstairs. Did I, dear?" Miss Marple's expression was innocent. "Perhaps I was thinking aloud. One does at my age." But she moved back to the range and examined its flue, tracing with her eyes the path it must take upward through the building. "If one stood here and looked up," she mused, "one would see the bathroom flue outside the window. Would one not? Running up the exterior wall?" Ted confirmed this with a curt nod. "Best practice. That keeps the combustion gases away from the living spaces." "And if something were to block that flue from below," Miss Marple continued, "the geyser would burn improperly and fill the bathroom with poison. But if that blockage were then to fall, dropping down into this range here, it would burn away, leaving little trace." Inspector Slack's face had taken on a new alertness. "You're saying someone deliberately blocked the bathroom flue from down here?" "I am saying it is a possibility worth considering," Miss Marple replied. "A cone of newspaper held in place by some temporary means, perhaps something that would melt. Ice, for instance. When the ice melted, the cone would fall, the flue would clear, and the evidence would be consumed in the range fire below." "But there was no fire," Florence said, her voice tight. "No," Miss Marple agreed, turning to look at her directly. "Which is why we have found these traces. If there had been a proper fire burning, we should have found nothing at all. The plan, if plan there was, depended upon the kitchen range being lit this evening, an unfortunate miscalculation. The silence that followed was profound. Even the clock on the wall seemed to tick more quietly, as though fearful of disturbing the weight of accusation that hung in the air. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "This is a serious allegation, Miss Marple. Murder, not accident. I make no allegations, Doctor. I simply observe that the evidence suggests a very particular set of circumstances, and that those circumstances could not have occurred by chance alone. Someone with knowledge of this kitchen, access to these materials, an understanding of how the flues operate could have arranged Inspector Harrington's death with considerable ingenuity. She paused, her blue eyes sweeping across the faces before her. And I believe, she added softly, that we shall find the proof of it before this night is ended. Chapter: Pulp in the Pudding Basin. The Chief Constable. Arrived at 9, a brisk man named Melchett, who had worked with Miss Marple on previous occasions and knew better than to dismiss her observations out of hand. He listened to Inspector Slack's report, examined the bathroom with Dr. Haydock, and then came down to the kitchen where Miss Marple waited with the patience of a woman who understood that official procedures must run their course. "You believe this was murder?" "Miss Marple," Melchett said without preamble, "not an unfortunate accident." "I believe the evidence warrants very careful examination," Miss Marple replied. "And I believe the evidence will be found if we look in the right places." She gestured toward the scullery table where the pudding basin still sat with its telltale rim of gray pulp. Melchett approached it, bent to examine the residue, then straightened with a thoughtful expression. "Flour paste," he said. "Used for what purpose, Mrs. Pike?" Florence stood with her back very straight, her hands clasped before her. "I cannot say, sir. As I told Miss Marple, kitchens accumulate all manner of odds and ends. Perhaps Connie can explain it." But Connie shook her head, her face troubled. "I use soda water for the jar labels, ma'am. I am certain of it, though the water did seem peculiarly thick." Miss Marple moved to stand beside Melchett. "If I might suggest, Colonel, the basin should be examined more closely. The pulp at the rim smells distinctly of soot as well as flour, not the sort of thing one encounters when soaking jar labels." Melchett produced a handkerchief and rubbed it along the basin's interior. When he held it to the light, dark streaks marred the white linen. He looked at Florence with new sharpness. "Mrs. Pike, I must ask you to account for your movements between 7 and 8:20 this evening." Florence's composure held, but her knuckles whitened where her hands gripped each other. "I was here in the kitchen preparing pies for tomorrow. Connie was with me until she went home at 8 hours. I was plating the last of them when I heard the thud from upstairs." "And you left the kitchen at any point during that time?" A pause, barely perceptible. "I stepped out to the yard briefly, perhaps at 8:10, to fetch more eggs from the cold store." "How long were you absent?" "No more than 2 or 3 minutes. Miss Marple had moved to the window that overlooked the yard. From here she noted one could see the exterior wall where the bathroom flue ran upward. One could also see the ice safe built into the wall, its door slightly ajar even now." "Mrs. Pike," Miss Marple said, turning back to the room, "do you keep ice throughout the year in the cold store?" "Yes," Florence's voice had taken on a defensive edge. "We make our own in winter and store it in sawdust. It lasts well into autumn if properly managed." "And you used ice today? For a blancmange?" "I set it this afternoon and turned it out before supper." "The mold is there on the draining board if you wish to see it." Miss Marple did wish to see it. The pudding mold was a simple affair, metal with a decorative pattern embossed on its sides. She lifted it and brought it to her nose, much as she had done with the basin. "How very curious," she observed. "This mold smells not of almond or vanilla or any of the usual flavorings one associates with blancmange. It smells rather distinctly of newspaper and soot." Lady Bantry had been following these exchanges with growing excitement. "Jane, do you mean to say that someone used this mold to form a plug of ice?" Miss Marple set the mold down carefully. "I think someone formed ice around a rolled cone of newspaper, creating a temporary plug that could be wedged into the bathroom flue register." The ice would hold the cone in place for perhaps half an hour, depending on the temperature. When it melted, the cone would fall, the flue would clear, and the ice would leave nothing but a puddle and a drip mark. Ted Jessup had been listening with mounting agitation. But the flue register is inside the bathroom. How could anyone place such a thing with the door chained from within? An excellent question, Miss Marple agreed. But I think we may find that the chain was applied after Inspector Harrington had collapsed, not before. A woman with steady hands and a knife blade could slip such a chain into place from outside if she knew the trick of it. You are accusing me. Florence's voice cut through the room like a blade. Without a shred of proof beyond some paste in a basin and your own wild imaginings. Melchett raised a hand. Mrs. Pike, no one has accused you of anything, but these are serious matters that require investigation. Miss Marple, what other evidence do you propose we should look for? The meat skewer rack above the range, Miss Marple said promptly. I believe we will find one skewer with particular markings. The sort of markings that would result from being pushed through wet newspaper and into ice, then held over flame to scorch the paste dry. Inspector Slack moved to the rack and examined each skewer in turn. The fourth one he lifted bore a delicate brown scorch at its tip, and what might have been paste residue along its shaft. Near the wooden handle, a faint damp ring showed where something cold had gripped it. Good Lord, Slack breathed. Additionally, Miss Marple continued, I believe Mrs. Pike's clothing may show traces of the work. Flour paste has a way of marking fabric, particularly around the cuffs, where one rests one's wrists while working. Florence's left hand moved instinctively to her right cuff, then stilled, but the damage was done. Melchett had seen the gesture, as had everyone else in the room. Mrs. Pike, he said gravely, I must ask you to remain available for further questioning, and I must ask you to provide the dress you are currently wearing for examination. The fight seemed to go out of Florence all at once. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time she looked her full age. I need no examination, she said quietly. Yes, there is paste on my cuff. I was careless when I removed the cone from the mold this afternoon. Then you admit, Melchett began, but Florence cut him off. I admit nothing beyond the making of paste and the use of a mold. These things are not crimes. The rest is Miss Marple's fantasy, constructed from domestic trifles that could mean anything or nothing. But her voice lacked conviction, and Miss Marple noticed that her left hand trembled now. The steady competence that had poured tea and carried trays quite vanished. There is one more thing, Miss Marple said softly. The telephone calls. I believe Nora Pike at the Exchange will have something very interesting to tell us about the calls made to and from the Blue Boar this evening, the timing of them, and perhaps more significantly, the voice that made them. What calls? Florence said sharply. The calls that established Mr. Vale's alibi, Miss Marple replied, and in doing so perhaps established your own opportunity. But that is a matter for tomorrow's investigation. I think the hour grows late, and there is much to be confirmed. Melchett looked at Slack, who nodded. Mrs. Pike, you will remain in this building tonight under observation. Tomorrow we shall continue this inquiry with rather more official thoroughness. As they filed out of the kitchen, Lady Bantry pressed close to Miss Marple's side. Jane, how did you know about the mold and the skewer? Those are such tiny details, Miss Marple smiled, her gentle smile. My dear Dolly, I have spent more than 70 years observing kitchens and the women who work in them. Ice molds smell of what you put in them. Skewers bear the marks of their use, and flour paste clings to fabric just as it clings to paper. These are not mysteries. They are simply the small truths of domestic life that most people never think to notice. They emerged into the tap room where Edmund Vale sat alone, his smooth face drawn with worry. He rose as they entered, but no one spoke to him. Miss Marple paused at the door and looked back at the kitchen, at Florence Pike standing rigid and alone in the center of her domain. "The tragedy," she murmured, "is that cleverness without wisdom so often leads to this. A clever plan executed with skill and nerve, but wisdom would have known that small things tell large tales and that a kitchen keeps its secrets poorly." Chapter 5. The Damp Gravel and the Drip Mark. The morning dawned with that particular crispness of early September, when summer has not quite relinquished its hold, but autumn whispers its intentions in the cool dawn air. Miss Marple rose at her customary hour, attended to her garden before breakfast, and by 9:15 was prepared to receive Colonel Melchett, who had telephoned to request her presence at the Blue Boar for what he termed a thorough reconstruction of events. The inn wore a subdued aspect in daylight. The tap room stood empty, save for Inspector Slack, who was conducting a meticulous search of the premises. Florence Pike sat in the private parlor under the watchful eye of a constable, her face drawn but composed. The events of the previous evening had aged her visibly, or perhaps it was merely that the mask of competent efficiency had slipped to reveal the woman. Beneath, Melchett greeted Miss Marple in the yard behind the inn, where the morning sun illuminated details that had been obscured by evening shadows. Dr. Haydock stood examining. The exterior wall where the bathroom flue emerged, a simple metal pipe that rose some 10 feet before terminating. In a cowl designed to prevent rain entering the system, "Miss Marple," Melchett said, "you mentioned last night that there should be evidence of water beneath the bathroom window, puddles where no puddles ought to be." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, moving to stand beneath the window in question. "The gravel here is quite dry, you see, as one would expect after several days without rain. Yet there, just beneath the sill, you will observe a small darkened patch where moisture has dampened the stones." Haydock crouched to examine the area more closely. "She is quite right, Melchett. The gravel shows clear signs of recent wetting, not rain, which would have spread more widely, but something concentrated, as though water had dripped from above, or ice had melted," Miss Marple suggested. "If one were to place a block of ice on that window ledge, or more precisely, if one were to wedge a piece of ice into the flue register just above, the meltwater would naturally drip down the exterior wall and fall to the ground below." Melchett examined the wall itself. The paint bore a faint streak, barely visible, where water had traced a path downward. It could have been dismissed as nothing, a trick of weathering or an old stain, but taken together with the dampened gravel, it formed a pattern. "The flue register shelf inside," Miss Marple continued, "bore that curious wet soot mark, soot that should have been dry and dusty from months of accumulation. But if ice had been placed against it, if cold water had run across that shelf as the ice melted, it would create precisely such an effect. Wet soot running like a tear down wood that ought to have remained pristine between cleanings." "You paint a very complete picture, Miss Marple," Melchett observed. "But pictures require proof. Can you demonstrate how such ice could have been formed and deployed?" "I believe I can suggest the method, though I am too old to attempt the demonstration myself. But perhaps Inspector Slack might assist, and Ted Jessup, whose knowledge of the building structure would be invaluable." The party moved inside, collecting Slack and, with some reluctance on his part, Ted Jessup. They assembled in the kitchen where the pudding mold still sat on the draining board, now tagged as evidence. Miss Marple lifted the mold gently, holding it as one might hold a child's toy while explaining a conjuring trick. "A newspaper is rolled into a cone," she began. "The sort of cone children make for holding sweets at a fair. The wide end is sealed with flour paste, which dries to form a reasonably waterproof barrier. This cone is then placed point upward in the mold, and water is poured around it. Not into it, you understand, but around it, filling the space between the cone and the mold's walls." She mimed the action, her wrinkled hands moving with surprising precision. The mold is then placed in the ice safe overnight, or for several hours at minimum. The water freezes into a ring of ice with the newspaper cone at its center. When removed from the mold, one has a most ingenious device, a paper cone held rigid by a collar of ice. Lady Bantry, who had arrived moments earlier with what she cheerfully described as a widow's privilege to be uselessly present, clapped her hands. "Jane, how perfectly diabolical! And then what?" Miss Marple set down the mold. "Then one needs only to wedge this device into the flue register above the geyser. The ice holds the cone firmly in place, blocking the draft entirely. The geyser, attempting to burn, finds insufficient oxygen and produces carbon monoxide instead of harmless carbon dioxide. The room fills with poison while the occupant, relaxing in a hot bath, grows drowsy and then unconscious. And the ice melts," Haydock said slowly, following the logic. "The cone falls down the flue into the kitchen range below, where it burns away if a fire is lit, or merely smolders if no fire burns. Either way, the evidence is largely destroyed." "Precisely," Miss Marple confirmed. "But our murderer made several small errors. First, there was no fire in the range last evening, so the cone did not burn completely. Second, the weather was warmer than perhaps anticipated, so the ice melted more quickly than planned, leaving that telltale puddle and drip mark. Third, the haste of the work left traces. Paste in the basin, paste on the cuff, the skewer with its scorch mark where it was used to prop the device and then briefly heated to dry any remaining dampness." "But how was the device placed?" Slack demanded. "The door was chained from inside. We forced it ourselves." Miss Marple turned to Ted Jessup. "Mr. Jessup, you have worked in many houses, fitted many locks and chains. Is it possible to engage a door chain from outside the door if one has the proper tool and the knowledge?" Ted shifted uncomfortably. "It can be done," he admitted, "with a thin blade, like a palette knife or a good kitchen knife, and if you know the angle of it. Slip the blade through the gap, lift the chain with the tip, swing it over to the catch. Takes a steady hand and practice, but it can be done. I have done it myself when folk lock themselves in by accident." Miss Marple nodded. "A landlady familiar with the doors of her establishment, who perhaps has had occasion to help forgetful guests in just such circumstances, would know this trick. She could enter the bathroom while Inspector Harrington lay unconscious, verify that he was past saving, engage the chain from outside, and create the illusion of a room secured from within." Florence Pike's voice came from the parlor doorway, where she stood with the constable still at her shoulder. "You're very certain, Miss Marple. Very certain indeed for a woman working from puddles and paste smears." "I'm certain only of what the evidence reveals," Miss Marple replied gently. "The ice that held your cone in place also betrayed you when it melted. Ice preserves, Mrs. Pike, but it also releases. It held your secret for half an hour, then let it go into the gravel and down the wall for all to see." Florence's face remained impassive, but something flickered in her eyes. A recognition, perhaps, that the game had run its course. Melchett stepped forward. "Mrs. Pike, I am placing you under formal arrest for the murder of Inspector Harrington. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence." The room held its breath, waiting for denial, for outrage, for anything but the quiet acceptance that settled over Florence like a shroud. "He would have destroyed everything," she said at last, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything I have worked for, everything Edmund worked for. All gone because of questions about invoices and deliveries and money that harmed no one." She looked at Miss Marple with something that might have been respect. "You're right about the ice. It melted faster than I calculated. I thought the evening cool enough, but I was wrong. In murder, as in cooking, timing is everything." And with that admission, made so calmly it chilled the blood more than any protestation of innocence, Florence Pike surrendered herself to justice. Chapter 6. 2 calls, 1 voice. The arrest of Florence Pike sent ripples through St. Mary Mead that would be felt for weeks to come. But the immediate consequence was a summons to the telephone exchange, where Nora Pike sat at her switchboard with the expression of a woman who has spent a sleepless night wrestling with conscience. Nora was no relation to Florence, despite the shared surname, a fact she took pains to establish the moment Colonel Melchett, Inspector Slack, and Miss Marple entered the cramped room that served as St. Mary Mead's connection to the wider world of telecommunication. She was a thin woman of perhaps 30, with quick, nervous hands and the pale complexion of one who works indoors beneath artificial light. "I have been thinking all night," she said without preamble, "about the calls yesterday evening. I told Mabel, the night girl, that something seemed odd about them, but she said I was imagining things. Now I see I was not." Miss Marple settled herself in the only visitor's chair, arranging her handbag on her lap with the air of one prepared for a lengthy interview. "Perhaps you might tell us about these calls, my dear. The precise timing would be most helpful, if you recall it." Nora consulted a ledger before her, though Miss Marple suspected she could have recited the information from memory. At 12 minutes past 8, the Blue Boar line rang through to Mr. Vale's office number. That would be at the contractor's yard on the Medmenham Road. 3 rings. Then the connection was terminated from the calling end. Terminated by whom? Slack asked. "By whoever was on the Blue Boar line, the calling end," she said. Then at 16 minutes past 8, Mr. Vale's office line rang through to the Blue Boar. That call was answered after 1 ring by Mrs. Pike, or so I understood at the time. "You say at the time," Melchett interjected. "Do you now think otherwise?" Nora twisted her hands together. "That is what troubles me, sir. Both calls, you see, had the same voice quality, the same careful, deliberate way of speaking that Mr. Vale uses when he's on the telephone. He enunciates very clearly as though he is addressing someone hard of hearing. Most distinctive." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You're saying that both calls, the one from the Blue Boar to Mr. Vale's office and the one from Mr. Vale's office to the Blue Boar, were made by the same person. I cannot swear to it in a court of law, Miss Marple, but yes, that is my belief. The voice that asked for the office connection at 12 was the same voice that placed the return call at 16. Both times speaking in that particular measured way. But that would mean," Lady Bantry said, then stopped, her eyes widening. "Oh, how very clever. How perfectly, horribly clever," Miss Marple nodded. "It would mean that Mr. Vale was not speaking from his office at all, but from somewhere much closer. Perhaps from the yard at the Blue Boar, where the telephone could be accessed without entering the building proper." "There is a telephone in the yard," Slack confirmed grimly. "An extension line for delivery men and such. Vale could have used it easily enough. But what purpose would such deception serve?" Melchett demanded. "To establish an alibi," Miss Marple replied, "and more importantly, to establish Mrs. Pike's whereabouts at the critical time. Consider, at 12 minutes past 8, someone at the Blue Boar calls Mr. Vale's office. That someone would naturally be assumed to be Mrs. Pike, seeking to speak with Vale. But the call is terminated quickly before any conversation takes place. Then at 16 minutes past 8, Mr. Vale's office returns the call and Mrs. Pike answers. 2 calls, 2 locations, seemingly proving that both parties were where they claimed to be during the time Inspector Harrington was dying. "Except they were not," Slack said slowly. "Vale made both calls, likely from the yard telephone, where he could speak without being overheard by those in the tap room. The first call established that someone at the Blue Boar was trying to reach him. The second call, placed 4 minutes later, allowed him to pretend he was calling back from his office when, in fact, he never left the premises." "And where was Mrs. Pike during these 4 minutes?" Melchett asked. "Upstairs," Miss Marple said quietly. upstairs verifying that her mechanism had worked, that Inspector Harrington was beyond help, and setting the chain on the door to complete the illusion of a locked room. When the telephone rang at 8:16, she hurried down to answer it, breathless perhaps, but able to claim she had been in the kitchen the entire time. Nora Pike's face had gone quite white. Then I provided their alibi without knowing it. When you asked me last night about calls, Mrs. Pike, I confirmed what you wanted me to confirm. You confirmed what you believe to be true, Miss Marple assured her. You're not at fault, my dear. The deception was carefully planned to rely upon exactly such honest recollection. But Mabel might remember more, Nora said urgently. She came on at 8 and would have handled the second call. She remarked to me this morning that Mr. Vale had been very precise in his diction, as though reading from a prepared script. Melchett made a note. We shall speak with Mabel as well. Mr. Vale will have considerable difficulty explaining why he placed a call to himself, or rather, why he created the elaborate pretense of doing so. They found Edmund Vale in his office at the contractor's yard, a neat building that smelled of sawdust and varnish. He rose from his desk with the smooth courtesy that characterized all his dealings, but his eyes held the weariness of a man who knows the net is drawing closed. Mr. Vale, Melchett began, I must ask you about your telephone calls on the evening of Inspector Harrington's death. Vale's composure held admirably. I telephoned my office from the Blue Boar, received no answer, and my office returned the call some minutes later. Is there some question about this? The question, Miss Marple said gently, is why you would telephone your own office from the yard telephone at the Blue Boar, allow it to ring 3 times, then return to that same yard telephone to place a call back to the Blue Boar 4 minutes later, all while pretending to be in 2 places at once. The color drained from Vale's face with gratifying swiftness. I do not know what you mean. I think you do, Mr. Vale. The exchange has records of both calls originating from locations you controlled. More significantly, the operator reports that both calls were made in your distinctive speaking voice. You created an alibi not only for yourself, but for Mrs. Pike, allowing her the time she needed to complete her dreadful work upstairs. Vale sat down heavily. His hands shook as he reached for a cigarette, fumbled it, let it fall to the desk. I knew nothing of murder, he said hoarsely. I swear it. Florence asked me to make the call. Said she needed to account for her time because Connie had left early and she would be alone in the kitchen. I thought it was about the invoices, about giving her an alibi if questions were asked about the books. But you knew Inspector Harrington was investigating irregularities in your accounts, Miss Marple said. I knew he was asking questions, yes, but I believed that Florence merely wanted to protect herself from suspicion of helping me adjust certain figures. Small things, you understand? Minor accommodations that harmed no one. I never imagined, never dreamed she would do something so terrible. Yet you helped her, Slack said flatly. Whether you knew the full scope or not, you helped her establish the means to commit murder. Vale's head dropped into his hands. God help me, I did, but I did not know. I swear upon everything holy I did not know. Miss Marple rose from her chair, her face grave. That, Mr. Vale, is for the courts to determine. But I will say this. Ignorance of the full crime does not absolve one of participation in its preparation. You valued your contracts and your profits more than you valued truth. And a good man died because of the web of deceit you and Mrs. Pike wove between you. The words hung in the air like a judgment, and Edmund Vale, that smooth and prosperous man, wept. Chapter 7. The Geyser That Sang Too Softly. The afternoon found Ted Jessup in his workshop, a converted stable behind his cottage, where the tools of his trade hung in orderly rows, and the air smelled perpetually of solder and pipe-joint compound. He had been summoned there by Inspector Slack, who arrived with Colonel Melchett, and somewhat to Ted's obvious discomfort, Miss Marple. The geyser was brought from the Blue Boar under Ted's vehement protest that removing it would accomplish nothing, that it was in perfect working order now, and had been in perfect working order before the tragedy. But Slack had insisted, and now the apparatus sat on Ted's workbench like an accused man awaiting judgment. "Walk us through it, Jessup," Slack commanded. "Show us how the thing works, and why it went wrong." Ted approached the geyser with the reverence of a craftsman for his installation. "This is an instantaneous water heater," he began, his rough hands moving with surprising delicacy over the mechanism. "Gas enters here, ignites at the pilot, heats the water as it passes through these coils. Simple, reliable, safe, when properly maintained." "And you maintained it," Melchett said. "Every 3 months, regular as clockwork. Last inspection was mid-August. Everything clean, everything functioning as it should." Miss Marple peered at the apparatus with the focused attention she might give to an unusual knitting pattern. Yet on the evening of Inspector Harrington's death, the flame burned yellow and low, rather than blue and vigorous. What would cause such a change in so short a time? Ted's jaw tightened. A blockage in the flue would do it. Starve the flame of air, force it to burn wrong. But I'm telling you, there was no blockage when I checked it. "There was a blockage that evening," Slack said. "We know that much. The question is whether it occurred naturally or was placed deliberately." Ted's face darkened. "If you are suggesting I had anything to do with that man's death, you're speaking nonsense. I installed that geyser 3 years ago and have kept it running perfect ever since. My reputation stands on such work." "No one questions your professional competence, Mr. Jessup," Miss Marple said soothingly. "Indeed, it is precisely because you maintain your equipment so well that the blockage seems suspicious. A flue that was clear in August does not spontaneously obstruct itself in September without cause." "Bird's nest," Ted muttered. "Sootfall, any number of natural causes." "But there was no bird's nest found," Melchett observed. "And the flue interior, when we examined it this morning, showed no accumulation of soot beyond the normal coating one would expect. What it did show, however, were marks on the interior walls, consistent with something being inserted and then removed." Ted stared at the flue pipe that Slack had also brought from the Blue Boar. The marks were faint but visible, fresh. Scrapes in the layer of soot that lined the metal. Something was pushed up from below, Miss Marple said. Or more accurately, something was pushed down from above into the register throat, a cone of newspaper held rigid by ice, as we have established. When the ice melted and the cone fell, it left these marks where the paper scraped against the metal. Ted examined the marks with the craftsman's eye, then straightened slowly. That could account for it. The paper would block the draft entirely until it fell away." Miss Marple moved closer to the workbench. "Mr. Jessup, I wonder if you might demonstrate for us how the geyser sounds when operating correctly, and how it would sound when the flue was blocked." Ted hesitated, then connected a gas line to a cylinder he kept for testing purposes. He lit the pilot, adjusted the flow, and the geyser came to life with a cheerful sighing sound, steady and purposeful. The flame visible through the viewing glass burned bright blue. "That is how it should sound," he said with evident satisfaction, "like a kettle that is happy with its work." "And if the flue were blocked?" Miss Marple prompted. Ted adjusted a damper he had rigged for testing purposes, gradually closing off the air supply. The flame yellowed, diminished, and the sound changed to a low, almost sullen mutter. "That is what we heard," Slack said. "That exact sound when we broke into the bathroom. Yellow flame barely burning, just enough to produce the poison." Ted shut off the gas with more force than necessary. A deliberate act, then. Someone who knew how the system worked, who understood that blocking the flue would create the conditions for carbon monoxide without extinguishing the flame entirely. Someone, Miss Marple suggested gently, or several someones working in concert. Mrs. Pike to create the device and place it. Mr. Vale to establish the alibi through his telephone deception. But I wonder, Mr. Jessup, she continued, whether anyone consulted you about the geysers operation beforehand. Ted's head snapped up. Consulted me? No one consulted me about anything. Why would they? Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple conceded. But in casual conversation over a pint in the tap room, might someone have asked you about how geysers work, about what would happen if a flue were blocked, about the dangers of carbon monoxide? Ted's brow furrowed as he searched his memory. Florence asked me something of the sort, he said slowly. Must have been a week ago, perhaps 10 days. Said she had read something in the newspaper about a family poisoned by a faulty water heater and wanted to know if our geyser at the bore was safe. And what did you tell her? Melchett asked sharply. I told her the truth that a blocked flue was the main danger, that it would cause the flame to burn yellow and produce carbon monoxide instead of proper exhaust. I told her the geyser at the bore was safe because I maintained it regular and the flue was always kept clear. You told her, in effect, exactly how to create the conditions for murder, Slack said flatly. Ted's face went gray. I never imagined she was asking for such a reason. It seemed a natural question, a landlady concerned for her guests' safety. Miss Marple touched his arm briefly, a gesture of unexpected sympathy. Of course you did not imagine it, Mr. Jessup. Murderers do not announce their intentions. They ask innocent questions and receive innocent answers, then twist that knowledge to terrible purpose. You're guilty of nothing beyond honesty. But Ted shook his head, his hands clenching on the edge of the workbench. I gave her the knowledge that killed that man. However innocent my intent, the result is the same. The result is that a murderer used information any competent plumber would possess, Melchett said firmly. You will not be charged with any crime, Jessup, though you may be called to testify about this conversation. After they left the workshop, Lady Bantry, who had been waiting outside, fell into step beside Miss Marple. The poor man looked quite devastated, Jane, Miss Marple nodded slowly. He is devastated by what his knowledge accomplished, even though he bears no moral culpability. It is a hard thing, Dolly, to realize that one's innocent words have been weaponized by another. Mr. Jessup takes pride in his work, in keeping people safe through proper maintenance. To learn that his very expertise contributed to a death will haunt him for some time. But surely he cannot blame himself. He can, and he will, at least for a while. That is the nature of good people, my dear. They accept responsibility even when responsibility is not truly theirs. Florence Pike asked a clever question and received the answer she needed. The guilt is hers, not his. But I suspect Mr. Jessup will hear that yellow flame in his dreams for many nights to come, singing its soft song of death. Chapter 8. Alibis in the Tap Room. The formal interviews took place in the private parlor of the Blue Boar, that same room where Inspector Harrington had briefly conferred with Slack before ascending to his fatal bath. Colonel Melchett had requisitioned the space with Florence Pike's grudging permission, though she was not present herself, having been removed to more secure accommodations, in much Benham pending formal charges. Miss Marple sat in the corner with her knitting, a position she had occupied during more than one police investigation over the years. She had learned that witnesses often forgot her presence after the first few minutes, focusing instead on the authority figures asking questions, and that this selective invisibility could prove remarkably useful. The timeline, Melchett said, spreading several sheets of paper across the table, tells us that Inspector Harrington went upstairs at 10 minutes to 8. The thud that brought us running occurred at 8:20. That gives us a window of 30 minutes during which the murder apparatus did its work. During which time, Slack added, consulting his own notes, every person in the establishment claims to have been occupied with innocent activities, in full view of witnesses. Except that the witnesses are each other, Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking softly. Which is always the difficulty with conspiracies, is it not? The conspirators provide alibis for one another, and untangling the truth becomes rather like picking apart a badly knotted skein. They began with Edmund Vale, who was brought in wearing the expression of a man who has not slept and does not expect to sleep again soon. His smooth facade had cracked comprehensively, revealing something smaller and more frightened beneath. "Mr. Vale," Melchett said without preamble, "take us through your movements between 7:45 and 8:20 yesterday evening." Vale cleared his throat. "I was in the tap room until shortly after 8. Rose Latimer was with me, and there were 2 men from Pulley's farm. We were discussing the parish hall contract specifications. For the entire time?" Slack pressed. Vale hesitated. "I stepped out briefly, perhaps at 5 minutes to 8, to make use of the facilities in the yard." "The facilities being the telephone," Miss Marple observed mildly. Vale's shoulders sagged. "Yes, the telephone. I placed the first call, as I have already admitted. Then I returned to the tap room for a few minutes before going out again to place the second call. I was back inside by 8:20. "How very convenient," Slack said acidly. "And during your absences, no one remarked upon your departure." People step outside frequently, for air, for the lavatory, for any number of reasons. It occasioned no comment. Rose Latimer was called in next, a sharp-featured woman who sat with her handbag clutched in her lap like a shield. She confirmed Vale's account with the precision of someone accustomed to recording facts. "Mr. Vale was at the table with us until just before 8, she said. He excused himself, returned after a few minutes, then excused himself again shortly thereafter. I assumed he was feeling unwell, as he had eaten the cold chicken, which can be difficult on the digestion." "You did not think to mention his absences when first questioned," Melchett observed. "I saw no relevance," Rose replied stiffly. "Men excuse themselves from table regularly. I am not in the habit of monitoring their movements." "But you are in the habit of monitoring a great deal else," Miss Marple suggested gently. "Your work as Mr. Vale's typist requires considerable attention to detail, does it not? You must surely have noticed the irregularities in the invoicing that Inspector Harrington was investigating." Rose's thin face flushed. "I type what I'm given to type. I do not question my employer's business arrangements." "Even when those arrangements involve fraud?" Slack said flatly. "I am a typist, not an accountant." Rose's voice rose slightly. "If Mr. Vale chose to adjust certain figures, that was his concern, not mine." "Yet you benefited from his generosity," Miss Marple said, her eyes on her knitting. "A woman in your position, earning what a typist earns, could not normally afford that rather expensive brooch you wear. Garnet set in gold, unless I am much mistaken." Rose's hand went instinctively to her throat where the brooch pinned her collar. "It was a gift from Mr. Vale." "In gratitude for your discretion," Miss Marple said. "You knew about the fraud, Miss Latimer. You typed the false invoices, maintained the duplicate ledgers, and kept silent because silence was profitable. You may not have known about the murder, but you certainly knew about the crimes that precipitated it." Rose said nothing, but her expression had hardened into something defensive and closed. The 2 farm men from Pulley's were interviewed next, thick-set. Brothers named Clemens, who had been at the Blue Seer, bore for their customary Wednesday pint. They remembered Vale holding forth about building specifications, remembered him leaving the table twice, remembered little else of significance. "There was a bit of a clatter out in the yard," the younger Clemens offered. Round about 5 to 8, I should say. Sounded like someone knocked into the ash bin or some such. Vale placing his first call, Slack muttered, making a note. Connie Jessup came in twisting her apron, her round face anxious. She had been helping in the kitchen until 8, she said, when Florence had sent her home, saying she could manage the rest herself. Was that usual? Melchett asked. For Mrs. Pike to dismiss you before the evening's work was complete? Connie considered this. Not unusual exactly, but not regular either. Sometimes if it was quiet, she would send me off early. Last night she said she only had the pies left to plate, and I might as well get home to my Ted. And you left immediately, within a few minutes? Yes, sir. I untied my apron, collected my shawl, and went out the back way, as I always do. Did you see Mrs. Pike after you left? Connie shook her head. I went straight home. Ted was already there. Had been since 7. We had our supper together. Which gives your husband an alibi for the critical time, Miss Marple observed. How very thoughtful of Mrs. Pike to ensure you could provide that testimony. Connie's eyes widened. You think she sent me home on purpose so I could say Ted was home? I think Mrs. Pike was very careful about alibis all around, Miss Marple replied. She sent you home to establish your husband's whereabouts, enlisted Mr. Vale to establish her own, and arranged matters so that no one could definitively place her in the kitchen during the crucial minutes when the ice would have melted and the cone would have fallen. But I was there until 8, Connie protested. Florence was plating pies the whole time I was there. Was she? Miss Marple asked. Or was she moving between the kitchen and the scullery? Perhaps stepping out to the ice safe in the yard, perhaps making brief trips upstairs while you assumed she remained nearby. In a busy kitchen, Mrs. Jessup, with pots steaming and ovens warm, one does not always notice brief absences, particularly if one trusts the other person implicitly. Connie's face had gone quite pale. She did go to the scullery several times, and once she said she needed to check a window upstairs that she thought she had left open, but she was only gone a minute or 2. Long enough, Slack said grimly, to verify that Harrington was past helping, and to set the chain on the door. After Connie had been dismissed, Melchett leaned back in his chair with evident frustration. Every alibi is incomplete. Every witness saw only part of the picture, and the conspirators have woven their stories together so thoroughly that separating truth from fabrication becomes nearly impossible. Not quite impossible, Miss Marple said, setting down her knitting. We know that Florence Pike had opportunity during the minutes when she was supposedly alone in the kitchen. We know that Edmund Vale created a false alibi through his telephone deception. We know that Rose Latimer was aware of the fraudulent activities that motivated the murder. What we have is not a single conspiracy, but rather layers of complicity, with Florence at the center, weaving threads that bound the others to her purpose, whether they understood that purpose or not. She rose from her chair, her face grave. The alibis in the tap room were carefully constructed, Colonel, but they were constructed to hide one crucial fact, that Florence Pike had both opportunity and means to commit murder during those 30 minutes when everyone else was conveniently occupied elsewhere. She sent Connie home, enlisted Vale's help with the telephone calls, and moved through her own domain with the confidence of a woman who knew every corner, every timing, every detail of her carefully laid plan. And the plan nearly succeeded, Melchett said. Nearly, Miss Marple agreed. But not quite, because small things betray large crimes. And alibis that are too neat invariably prove to be alibis that have been too carefully arranged. Chapter 9. A Quality of Momentum. Miss Marple had spent the afternoon in quiet consultation with Dr. Haydock, who had completed his examination of the various physical exhibits collected from the Blue Boar's kitchen. The doctor arrived at Miss Marple's cottage just as the clock struck 6. carrying a leather case that bore the official seals of the police laboratory. Lady Bantry was already present, having invited herself to tea with a transparent excuse that her cook had burned the scones, and she simply could not face another meal of apologetic offerings. "Well," Haydock said without preamble as he accepted a cup of tea, "you were right about everything, Miss Marple. The skewer tells a remarkable story for such a humble implement." He opened his case and withdrew the meat skewer that Florence Pike had handed down from the rack above her range. In the lamplight, the brown scorch at its tip seemed more pronounced, and the faint watermark near the handle more distinct. "Under magnification," Haydock continued, "the tip shows exposure to direct flame, brief but intense. The scorching pattern suggests the metal was held in fire for perhaps 20 to 30 seconds, long enough to dry any moisture clinging to it, but not long enough to damage the wood of the handle significantly." "And the moisture would have been from the ice," Miss Marple said. "Precisely. The watermark shows characteristics consistent with melted ice rather than ordinary water. There is a particular mineral pattern, quite distinctive, that matches the ice samples we took from Mrs. Pike's ice safe." Lady Bantry set down her teacup with a decided click. "So the skewer was definitely used to prop the ice device in the flue register." "More than that," Haydock said, warming to his subject. "We found traces of flour paste in the wood grain near the tip, and embedded in that paste, microscopic fibers consistent with newsprint. The Evening Echo uses a particular paper stock that matches these fibers exactly." Miss Marple nodded with satisfaction. "The complete picture, then. The newspaper cone was sealed with flour paste, positioned in the mold, ice formed around it. Then the whole apparatus was wedged into the flue register using the skewer, pushed through the paper and into the ice to hold it secure. When Florence Pike realized the paste might still be damp and detectable, she briefly heated the skewer over the range flame to dry it, creating that telltale scorch." "But she could not eliminate all the evidence," Haydock agreed. "The paste penetrated too deeply into the wood grain, and the heating actually fixed some of the paper fibers in place rather than destroying them. These modern scientific methods are quite extraordinary," Lady Bantry observed. "In our youth, Jane, such evidence would have been invisible." "In our youth, Dolly," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile, "the evidence would have been equally present, but less easily proven. I suspect Florence Pike relied upon the assumption that a kitchen skewer, used daily for various purposes, would show all manner of marks and stains that could be dismissed as ordinary kitchen residue." "She did not account for your eye," Haydock said. "Most people would never have noticed the scorch, or if they noticed it, would have thought nothing of it." "Most people do not spend their lives observing kitchens," Miss Marple said. "But I have learned that kitchen implements are rather like servants, Doctor. They bear the marks of their employment, and those marks tell stories to anyone with the patience to read them." There was a knock at the door, and Inspector Slack entered, his expression suggesting that he brought news of significance. "Colonel Melchett requests your presence at the Blue Boar, Miss Marple. We have recovered additional evidence from the range, ashpond, that requires your interpretation." The party reconvened in the Blue Boar's kitchen, now bearing the slightly abandoned air of a room whose mistress has been removed. The range had been carefully dismantled, and on the work table lay several evidence bags containing what appeared to be charred fragments. Melchett gestured to the largest bag. "We sifted the entire ash pan through fine mesh. Most of what we found was ordinary ash and cinders, but these pieces are different." He emptied the bag onto a white cloth, revealing perhaps a dozen scraps of blackened paper, none larger than a shilling. But even in their burnt state, one could discern that they had once been newsprint, and several bore the distinctive marks of having been coated with paste before burning. Miss Marple examined them with a magnifying glass borrowed from Haydock. "The paste created a protective layer," she observed. The paper burned, but not completely. Where the paste was thickest, particularly along what would have been the rim of the cone, the paper merely charred rather than turning to ash. She pointed to one particular fragment. This piece is especially telling. You can see where it was folded to create the cone shape. And here along the edge, the paste has preserved a partial fingerprint. Clear enough to identify? Slack leaned in eagerly. Dr. Haydock produced a photograph from his case. We lifted prints from the pudding basin this morning, and from the mold. This partial print matches the left index finger of Florence Pike. Left hand, Miss Marple murmured. Always the left hand. Lady Bantry, who had accompanied them despite protests about the impropriety of civilians at crime scenes, spoke up. You mentioned that before, Jane, about Florence pouring tea left-handed. What significance does that have? Consider, Miss Marple said, rising from her examination of the fragments, the work involved in creating the murder device. One must roll a newspaper into a cone, seal it with paste, position it in a mold, pour water around it, wait for it to freeze. Each step requires dexterity and precision. A right-handed person would naturally do such work right-handed, but Florence Pike does everything left-handed, from pouring tea to kneading dough, to, as we now see, applying paste to paper. The print confirms it, Melchett said, but there is more. We found, wedged in the ashpan's corner, where it escaped the fire entirely, a small twist of paper that was not completely charred. It appears to be from the narrow point of the cone, the part that would have been inserted deepest into the flue register. He displayed it with evident pride, a scrap no larger than a postage stamp, but bearing legible print. It was part of an advertisement for Vale's contracting firm, with his telephone number clearly visible. How perfectly appropriate, Miss Marple said quietly. She constructed her murder weapon from a newspaper page that advertised the very firm whose criminal activities she was attempting to protect. There is something almost theatrical about it, as though she could not resist leaving her signature upon her work. Or perhaps, Slack suggested, she simply grabbed the nearest newspaper without paying attention to its contents. Perhaps, Miss Marple agreed. But I think not. Florence Pike struck me as a woman who paid attention to every detail, who would have noticed what she was rolling and pasting. I suspect she found a certain grim satisfaction in using Vale's own advertisement as the instrument of death for the man investigating Vale's crimes. The room fell silent as this observation settled upon them, even Slack, not generally given to philosophical reflection, seemed affected by the image of Florence Pike, carefully rolling that particular page into its fatal shape. There is one more thing, Haydock said, breaking the silence. We analyzed the paste itself, both from the basin and from the skewer. It is a simple flour and water mixture, but it contains traces of salt, a particular proportion that matches exactly the proportions used in Mrs. Pike's bread dough. She used her own bread flour, Lady Bantry breathed, from her own kitchen stores. Indeed, Miss Marple said. And in doing so, she provided us with yet another link in the chain of evidence. The paste could have been made by anyone with access to flour and water, but this particular paste, with its distinctive salt content, could only have been made in this kitchen by someone intimately familiar with the proportions used here. Melchett gathered the evidence bags carefully. Between the skewer with its scorch and paste residue, the ashpan fragments with their preserved fingerprint, and the unburned twist with Vale's advertisement, we have physical proof to support your reconstruction, Miss Marple. Florence Pike's conviction is now beyond reasonable doubt. Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. Justice moves slowly, Colonel, but it moves with certainty when truth is allowed to emerge from careful observation. A skewer with a scorch seemed a small thing when first I noticed it, but small things compound into certainty when they all point in the same direction. They do indeed, Melchett agreed. And it is your gift, Miss Marple, to notice the small things that others overlook. Chapter 10. Blue Boar, Flu, Ice, and the Landlady's Left Hand. The final confrontation took place 3 days after Inspector Harrington's death, in the same parlor where the investigation had begun. Florence Pike sat with her shoulders squared and her face composed, flanked by the solicitor who had been appointed to represent her interests. Around the table sat Colonel Melchett, Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, and, in her corner chair, Miss Marple with her knitting. Edmund Vale had been brought from custody as well, his smooth features haggard, and his expensive suit rumpled from nights spent in less comfortable accommodations than he was accustomed to. Rose Latimer perched on a hard chair near the door, summoned as a witness, though not herself charged with any crime beyond complicity in the fraudulent accounting. The evidence had been laid out methodically. The skewer with its telltale scorch and paste residue, the fragments from the ashpan bearing Florence's fingerprint, the pudding mold that smelled of newsprint and soot, the drip marks below the bathroom window, and the testimony of Nora Pike about the telephone calls that had never been what they seemed. Melchett rose to address the assembly, his voice carrying the weight of official judgment. Mrs. Florence Pike, the evidence against you is comprehensive and damning. We can trace your movements through the physical artifacts you left behind. Reconstruct your method through the marks upon metal and paper and ice. But before formal charges are laid, I'm offering you the opportunity to provide your own account of events. Justice is better served by truth than by silence. Florence sat motionless for a long moment, her left hand resting upon the table before her. When she spoke, her voice was steady and curiously devoid of emotion, as though she were recounting someone else's story rather than her own. "Very well," she said. "I will tell you what happened, though I expect little mercy from it." She drew a breath and began. Inspector Harrington came to St. Mary Mead to investigate irregularities in the accounts of various tradesmen, Edmund's firm among them. For months, Edmund and I had maintained a small arrangement. He would inflate certain invoices for supplies to the Blue Boar. I would pay them without question, and he would return a portion of the excess to me in cash. It was a modest fraud, harming no one truly, or so I told myself. The brewery charged me extortionate rates for their beer. I simply recovered some of those costs through other means. Miss Marple's needles continued their steady rhythm, but her eyes remained fixed on Florence's face. When Harrington began asking questions, Edmund came to me in a panic. The inspector was thorough, he said, meticulous. He would trace every invoice, examine every ledger, follow every thread until the entire arrangement unraveled. We would both face criminal charges. The Blue Boar would be forfeit, my reputation destroyed. Edmund would lose his contracts, perhaps his freedom. "And so you decided to kill him," Slack said flatly. Florence's jaw tightened. "I decided to protect what I had built. This inn has been my life's work. I have run it alone since my husband died 12 years ago, maintained it through lean times and prosperous ones, built a reputation for honest dealing and good service. I would not see it swept away because a policeman could not look past the letter of the law to see that real harm had been done to no one." "Except to Inspector Harrington," Miss Marple said softly. "He suffered rather significant harm, I believe." Florence met her gaze directly. "I convinced myself he was the enemy, that he represented injustice rather than justice, that in protecting myself and Edmund, I was doing what any reasonable person would do when cornered." "You planned it carefully," Melchett said. "The ice, the telephone alibi, the timing." Florence nodded slowly. "I asked Ted Jessup about carbon monoxide, making it seem a casual inquiry about safety. He told me everything I needed to know, never suspecting my purpose. I experimented with the cone, testing how long the ice would hold in the September evening air. I chose the day when Connie could be sent home early to establish Ted's alibi, When I knew Harrington would want a bath after his journey. She paused, her fingers tracing the grain of the table. I formed the ice the night before, using the pudding mold with the newspaper cone sealed with flour paste. I kept it in the ice safe until the moment came. When Harrington went upstairs, I waited until I heard the water running. Then I carried the device up the back stairs. The bathroom door was not yet locked. I opened it quietly, wedged the cone into the flue register, using the skewer to hold it firm, latched the window, and withdrew. "And the chain on the door?" Miss Marple prompted. "I left it unchained until after." Florence's voice dropped slightly. "I knew the ice would melt in perhaps 30 minutes. I'd arranged for Edmund to make his telephone calls, establishing that I was downstairs at the crucial time. When sufficient time had passed, I went up the back stairs again, listened at the door, heard nothing. I opened it just enough to see that Harrington had collapsed. I verified that he was beyond help. Then I engaged the chain, using a palette knife, through the gap, pulling the door closed behind me as I did. So, the solicitor beside her shifted, uncomfortably, clearly wishing his client would cease her confession. But Florence seemed beyond caring about legal niceties. I returned to my kitchen, heard the cone fall into the range, watched it smolder there. I had planned to have the range burning properly so the evidence would be consumed entirely, but the evening was warm and I had miscalculated. When the thud came from upstairs, I played my part, the concerned landlady discovering tragedy. She looked around the table, her face drawn but her gaze unflinching. Everything Miss Marple deduced was correct. The wet soot, the puddle beneath the window, the paste on my cuff, the skewer with its scorch. I thought myself so clever, so careful. But I had not accounted for an elderly woman who notices pudding basins and the hand with which one pours tea. Miss Marple set down her knitting. "Mrs. Pike, I take no satisfaction in having unraveled your crime. You are, in your way, a capable and industrious woman. But you made the fundamental error of believing that your comfort, your security, justified taking a human life. Inspector Harrington was a decent man performing his duty. Whatever irregularities he investigated, they did not warrant murder." Florence's composure finally cracked, her shoulders sagging. "I know that now. In the dark hours of the night, I know it. But knowing changes nothing. The deed is done, and I must answer for it." Melchett rose. "Florence Pike, I am charging you with the willful murder of County Inspector James Harrington. Edmund Vale, you are charged as an accessory before the fact, having knowingly assisted in establishing a false alibi with knowledge of criminal intent." Vale made a sound that might have been protest or merely despair, but said nothing coherent. As they were led away, Florence paused at the door and looked back at Miss Marple. "You said the small domestic things are dreadfully eloquent. You were right. My own kitchen betrayed me. Every pot and pan and skewer speaking truths I thought I'd concealed." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "Kitchens are honest places, Mrs. Pike. They record the truth of what transpires within them, for those with eyes to see." After the prisoners had been removed, Lady Bantry joined Miss Marple on the pavement outside the Blue Boar. The afternoon sun slanted across the high street, and the village was returning to its customary rhythms, the drama of murder already fading into the background of ordinary life. "All that from a wet soot on a shelf," Dolly said quietly, echoing the observation from that first terrible evening. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully into her bag. "Little domestic things, my dear. Puddings, paste, and a left hand. They are dreadfully eloquent when people hope they will not be noticed, but nothing is too small to notice when a life has been taken unjustly. Inspector Harrington deserved better than to die in a strange bathroom because a woman valued her inn more than his life." They walked slowly toward Miss Marple's cottage, two elderly women in a village that had seen its share of darkness. but would in time recover and continue. And Edmund Vale? Lady Bantry asked. Do you think he truly knew? Miss Marple considered this. I think he knew enough to be culpable, but perhaps not enough to be called a murderer. He chose convenience over conscience, profit over principle, and in doing so became the tool of a more determined criminal. He will have years to contemplate that choice. As they reached the garden gate, Miss Marple paused to examine her roses, noting with satisfaction that the autumn blooms were beginning to show. Life continued, as it always did, even in the wake of death. The Blue Boar would find a new landlady. The parish hall would be built by a different contractor, and St. Mary Mead would absorb this tragedy, as it had absorbed others, folding it into the long memory of the village. But Miss Marple would remember Florence Pike and her fatal cleverness, her kitchen with its telltale implements, and the way that ice, which had seemed so solid and reliable, had melted away to reveal the truth beneath.